Because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive the telling. Some stories are buried in archives, some are erased from records, and some are hidden because if men truly understood them, they would never see power the same way again. In October of 1857, on a quiet plantation in Georgia, 6 powerful men gathered beneath warm lantern light to celebrate a wedding. Wine flowed, music drifted across polished wooden floors, laughter echoed through tall white columns. They believed the world outside those walls belonged to them. They believed the people who worked their land feared them. They believed control was permanent. But control is a dangerous illusion. Because somewhere beyond the glow of those lanterns, standing inside the dark tree line, a woman was waiting, a woman they believed was powerless, a woman they believed was broken, a woman they believed had already accepted her fate. Her name was Minerva Hall, and by sunrise, every man inside that house would be dead. Not by gunfire, not by poison, but by something far more terrifying, something patient, something silent, something that had been waiting for 8 months. Now here's the truth most history books will never tell you. Revenge is rarely born from rage. Rage burns fast, it explodes and fades. True revenge is cold, it is quiet, it grows slowly in the shadows while the world assumes nothing is happening. And Minerva understood something that powerful men often forget. The strongest weapon is not force, it is patience. You see, the night of the wedding was not the beginning of this story. It was the end of a plan that started the moment her daughter was taken. 14 years old, still humming songs while she worked, still believing the world held some kindness somewhere inside it, until the day the master of Red Hollow Plantation called her into the main house. The door closed behind her, and 4 men followed. The plantation ledger would later record her fate with a single number, $400. No name, no mention of the screams heard through the walls, no mention of the bruises, no mention of the moment a mother realized something inside her had changed forever. When Minerva begged for her daughter's return, the master struck her across the face and reminded her of a simple rule of the system he believed in. You are property. That sentence has echoed through history in 1,000 forms, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes hidden behind laws, sometimes disguised as order. But the meaning is always the same: control, ownership, dominance. And the men celebrating that night believed they possessed all 3. What they didn't realize was that the moment Minerva stopped crying, the moment she stood up from the dirt with blood on her lip, the moment she turned and walked away without another word, the balance of power had already begun to shift. Because when a person has nothing left to lose, they become something dangerous. And Minerva Hall was about to teach 6 men a lesson that the forest itself would help deliver. A lesson written not with ink, but with claws and silence and patience, the kind of patience that waits for the perfect night.
The morning her daughter disappeared did not begin with violence. It began with routine, the kind of quiet, repetitive routine that defined life on Red Hollow Plantation. Before the sun had even touched the tops of the pine trees, Minerva and her daughter were already awake. The air was thick with the damp breath of Georgia's autumn, and the smell of wet soil clung to everything. Her daughter, Liza, hummed softly as she braided her hair. It was a small habit she had carried since childhood. Whenever she worked, whenever she was nervous, whenever silence felt too heavy, she hummed. Minerva used to tell her it sounded like birds greeting the morning. But that morning, something felt different. The overseer rode past the cabins earlier than usual. His horse's hooves cracked against the hardened dirt like small thunderclaps. He didn't shout orders the way he normally did. He didn't even look at anyone. He simply rode toward the main house. That alone was strange, because when something strange happened on a plantation, it usually meant trouble was coming. Liza noticed it too. "Ma," she whispered while tying the last knot in her braid, "why he riding that early?" Minerva didn't answer immediately. Years of survival had taught her that instincts mattered. The body notices danger before the mind understands it, and her instincts were uneasy. "Stay close today," she said quietly. But the plantation did not care about a mother's instincts. An hour later, the horn sounded. Work assignments were shouted across the yard. Cotton fields, kitchen house, stable cleaning, and Liza's name. The call came from the front steps of the master's house. "Liza Hall!" Every head turned, because housework assignments were rare for someone her age. Usually that meant one thing: the mistress wanted extra help. But there was no mistress anymore. She had died 2 years earlier from fever, which meant something else was happening. Liza looked at her mother. Her humming had stopped. "Just cleaning, probably," Minerva said softly, trying to calm both of them. But the overseer wasn't looking at Liza. He was looking at the men standing behind him on the porch. 4 white men, all drinking from the same bottle, all smiling in a way that Minerva's stomach twisted. The master stepped forward. His voice carried across the yard with casual authority. "Bring the girl inside." Inside. Not the kitchen house, not the laundry room. Inside the main house. Something about that word froze the air. Liza hesitated, only for a second, but the overseer noticed. He grabbed her arm. "Move." Minerva stepped forward instinctively, a dangerous instinct. "Mister, I can come help too," she said quickly. The master laughed, the kind of laugh men use when they enjoy reminding others of their place. "No need," he replied. Then he added the sentence that would echo in Minerva's mind for the rest of her life. "We'll take good care of her." The door closed behind them, and the humming never returned. At first, there was silence. Workers tried to keep their heads down. Nobody wanted attention, because attention on a plantation usually meant punishment. But then the sounds began. A crash, a chair scraping, a muffled cry. Someone dropped a cotton sack in the field. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved, because everyone understood something terrible was happening, but no one had the power to stop it. Minerva stood frozen near the steps. Her entire body had become a listening device, every nerve straining, every breath shallow. Then she heard it, her daughter's voice, not humming, screaming. And in that moment, something inside Minerva Hall changed forever. Not anger, not panic, something colder, something deeper, something patient. Because she knew one terrible truth. If she ran inside that house, they would kill her, and Liza would still be gone. So she stood there, listening, memorizing every sound, every laugh, every voice, every man responsible. Because some wounds break a person, but others create something new. And what was forming inside Minerva Hall in that moment was not grief, it was a plan. If you'd like, I'll now continue with
Night fell slowly over Red Hollow Plantation. The fields emptied. Chains of tired footsteps dragged back toward the slave cabins, one by one, like shadows returning to their cages. But Minerva never moved. She stood outside the big house long after the horn signaled the end of work. The sky had already turned black. Lanterns burned in the windows of the master's house, and inside, the sound of laughter spilled out into the darkness. Men drinking, men celebrating, as if nothing had happened, as if a girl's screams were just another sound of the plantation. Finally, near midnight, the door opened. Two men dragged something down the porch steps, something small, something limp. They didn't speak. They didn't even look around. They simply dropped the body beside the tool shed like discarded trash. Then they went back inside. The door slammed, and the laughter continued. Minerva waited. She waited until the lanterns inside began to dim, until the music stopped, until the night insects were louder than the voices inside the house. Only then did she walk forward, slowly. Her steps made no sound on the dirt. When she reached the shed, she knelt beside the body. For a long time she didn't touch it, because a mother knows. Even before the truth is confirmed, she knows. Finally, her hands moved. She brushed dirt away from Liza's face. The girl's eyes were half open. The humming girl. The girl who braided her hair every morning. The girl who asked questions about the world beyond the plantation. Gone. But Minerva did not scream. She did not cry. The tears had already come earlier, while she stood outside the house listening. Now something else filled her chest, something quieter, something heavier. She lifted her daughter gently and carried her back toward the cabins. A few doors opened when they saw her passing. Faces appeared in the darkness, but nobody spoke. On plantations like Red Hollow, everyone understood the rules of survival. Witness nothing, say nothing, remember everything. Inside the cabin, Minerva laid Liza on the bed. She lit a candle. The flame flickered across the small wooden walls, and for the first time since the morning, Minerva spoke. But not to anyone in the room. She spoke to the darkness. I heard them. Her voice was calm, almost whispering. Each one of them. The overseer, the master, and the other men. 4 voices, 4 laughs, 4 men who believed nothing would ever happen to them, because on plantations like this, nothing ever did. But something had changed that night, because grief can break a person, or it can sharpen them, and Minerva Hall was no longer just a mother. She had become something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose. Over the next few days, she became invisible. She worked in the fields. She followed orders. She spoke to no one, but she watched everything. Which man drank the most? Which one wandered alone at night? Which one carried a knife? Which one trusted the dark too much? She memorized their habits the same way hunters study animals, patient, silent, waiting. Because revenge on a plantation could not be loud. It had to be quiet. It had to look like accidents. It had to move like shadows. And within 2 weeks, the first man would disappear. 2 weeks passed after Liza's death. Life on Red Hollow Plantation continued as if nothing had happened. The cotton fields still stretched endlessly under the burning sun. The horn still screamed every morning before sunrise, and the overseer still walked through the fields with his whip in hand. But something had changed. Not in the plantation, in Minerva. She no longer spoke to anyone unless she had to. She no longer hummed songs while working. She moved quietly, like someone who was always thinking. And every night, after the cabins went dark, she watched. There were 4 men responsible for that night: the plantation owner, the overseer, and 2 of the master's friends who had been visiting that evening. One of them was named Daniel Croft. Croft was a gambler and a heavy drinker. He stayed on the plantation longer than the others because he enjoyed the easy life there: free food, free whiskey, and no consequences. Almost every night, Croft would leave the big house drunk and wander toward the old storage barn behind the fields. Some said he liked to drink there alone. Others believed he used the place for darker reasons. But Minerva noticed something more important. He always went alone, and he always carried a lantern. On the 15th night after Liza's death, the air was thick and silent. Clouds covered the moon. The plantation slept. Croft stumbled out of the big house just like always, bottle in one hand, lantern in the other. He laughed loudly at something only he understood and began walking toward the barn. His footsteps were careless, unsteady. Drunk men rarely notice danger, especially when danger is patient. Inside the barn, the smell of old hay filled the air. Croft placed the lantern on a wooden crate and took a long drink from his bottle. He never noticed the shadow behind the stacked cotton bales. Minerva had been waiting there for nearly an hour, silent, breathing slowly, watching. Croft sat down and leaned against the wall, his eyes half closed. His lantern flickered. Then a small sound echoed behind him, just a shift of straw. "Hello?" No answer. He squinted into the darkness. "Anyone there?" Still nothing. He chuckled to himself. Just the wind. He turned back around, and that was the moment Minerva moved. Quick, silent, a rope looped around his neck before he could even stand. Croft choked in shock as the rope tightened. His bottle shattered on the ground. He grabbed the rope desperately, trying to pull it away, but Minerva had wrapped it around a wooden beam behind him, using his own weight against him. His feet kicked wildly. The lantern light shook across the barn walls. For a few seconds, Croft tried to scream, but no sound came out, only choking gasps. Minerva said nothing. She stood behind him, holding the rope, her face cold, her eyes empty. She watched as the man who laughed that night slowly lost his strength. His kicking slowed, then stopped. The barn fell silent again. Only the lantern flame moved. After a long moment, Minerva stepped forward. She untied the rope. Croft's body collapsed onto the dirt floor. She dragged him deeper into the barn, behind a stack of rotting hay bales. The smell there was strong enough to hide anything. Before leaving, she picked up the broken bottle and wiped the rope with a piece of cloth. Careful, clean, patient. Then she disappeared back into the darkness of the plantation. The next morning, Daniel Croft was nowhere to be found. Some said he had left the plantation during the night. Others believed he wandered off drunk and got lost in the swamps. No one searched very hard, because on plantations like Red Hollow, men disappeared all the time. But Minerva knew the truth, and for the first time since her daughter died, she slept, because this was only the beginning. 3 men remained. After Daniel Croft disappeared, the plantation continued its routine. No one seemed concerned. Drunk men wandered off all the time. Sometimes they never came back. The plantation owner simply assumed Croft had left during the night. But one man on the plantation was not so careless. The overseer. His name was Thomas Hale. Hale was feared by every worker in the fields, tall, broad-shouldered, and always carrying the long leather whip that hung from his belt. He believed fear was the only way to control people. Every mistake meant punishment. Every slow worker meant the whip. And on the night Liza died, Hale had been the one who dragged Minerva away. Since Croft vanished, Hale had become restless. Something about the disappearance bothered him. Croft had been drunk, yes, but he never left without money or his horse, and both were still there. At night, Hale began walking the plantation more often, checking the barns, the fields, the slave cabins.
He carried a lantern and a pistol with him. But no matter how many nights he walked, he never saw anything unusual. Minerva watched him from a distance, always silent, always patient. She knew Hale was different from Croft. He was stronger, more alert. This would require more planning. One evening, a violent storm rolled across the land. Thunder cracked across the sky. Rain hammered the roofs of the cabins. Most people stayed inside that night, but Hale never missed his patrol. He wrapped a thick coat around himself and stepped into the storm. The wind pushed against him as he walked through the muddy path between the cabins. His lantern swung wildly in the wind. Inside one of the cabins, Minerva sat quietly, listening, waiting. She knew storms were perfect. The rain erased footsteps. The thunder swallowed screams. When Hale reached the edge of the cotton fields, he stopped. Something felt wrong. He lifted the lantern higher. The wind moved through the tall plants like waves. Then he saw it. A figure moving slowly between the rows. Hale narrowed his eyes. "Who's out there?" he shouted. No answer. The figure continued walking. Hale stepped forward angrily. "No one leaves the cabins during a storm." The figure disappeared deeper into the field. Hale cursed and followed. The mud pulled at his boots as he forced his way through the thick plants. Rain soaked his coat. Lightning flashed across the sky. For a moment, the entire field turned white, and in that flash, he saw her, standing about 20 feet away, still, silent, Minerva. Hale recognized her instantly. "What are you doing out here?" he barked. No answer. She simply stared at him. Something about her expression made Hale uncomfortable. Cold, empty. He stepped closer. "You deaf now?" he shouted. Another lightning strike lit the sky, and in that moment, Hale finally noticed something. The ground behind him had turned soft and uneven. He took one more step forward, and the earth beneath him collapsed. Hale fell hard into a deep pit hidden under branches and loose soil. His lantern crashed beside him and went dark. The fall knocked the air from his lungs. Before he could climb out, a shadow appeared above the pit. Minerva stood there, looking down at him, rain falling across her face. Hale groaned and tried to stand. "What the hell is this?" But then he noticed the wooden spikes at the bottom of the pit. One had pierced through his leg, another through his shoulder. Pain exploded through his body. He tried to reach for his pistol, but Minerva spoke for the first time, her voice calm, quiet. "You remember my daughter." Hale froze. For a second, confusion crossed his face, then recognition, then fear. The storm roared above them. Hale tried to pull himself free, but the spikes held him in place. Minerva stepped closer to the edge of the pit. "You said she was nothing," she continued. Her voice did not shake. "You said she was property." Hale's breathing became heavy. "Listen, we can fix this." But Minerva only looked at him. For a long moment. Then she began pushing the loose dirt back into the pit. Hale's eyes widened. "Wait!" His voice disappeared beneath the storm. Mud and soil slowly buried the hole. His hands reached upward desperately, but the rain made the ground heavy. Within minutes, the pit was filled again. The field looked untouched, just another patch of wet soil under the storm. Minerva stood there a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabins. 2 men were gone now. Only 2 remained, and the most powerful one was still inside the big house.
After the stormy night when Thomas Hale disappeared, fear quietly spread across Red Hollow Plantation. 2 men had vanished. First Daniel Croft, then the overseer. At first, the plantation owner refused to believe anything was wrong. His name was Edward Whitmore. Whitmore was a powerful man, rich, respected by neighboring landowners. To him, the plantation was not a place of suffering. It was a business. Workers were numbers, fields were profit, and discipline meant control. But even Whitmore could not ignore two disappearances. The overseer was loyal, brutal but loyal. Men like Hale did not simply vanish. So Whitmore ordered the fields searched, the barns, the woods, the nearby riverbanks. But nothing was found. No body, no blood, no clues. The workers said nothing. They kept their heads down and continued working. But at night, whispers spread between the cabins. Something was happening on the plantation, something unseen, something patient. Whitmore became increasingly nervous. For the first time in years, he started locking the doors of the big house at night. He kept a rifle beside his bed, and he stopped drinking late into the evening. But fear does strange things to powerful men. It makes them imagine enemies everywhere. One night, nearly a month after Liza's death, Whitmore sat alone in his office. A storm lantern burned on his desk. Outside, the plantation was quiet. Too quiet. He stared at the ledger in front of him, pretending to work, but his mind kept drifting back to the missing men. Then he heard it, a sound, very faint, a creak somewhere inside the house. Whitmore looked up. The house servants had already gone to their quarters. No one should have been walking around. He stood slowly and picked up his rifle. The wooden floor creaked under his boots as he moved toward the hallway. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. The lantern light flickered along the walls. Whitmore stepped into the hallway. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong. A cold breeze moved through the house. Then another sound came from the back door, a slow, deliberate knock. Whitmore tightened his grip on the rifle. No one visited plantations this late at night. He walked toward the door carefully. The knock came again. 3 slow taps. Whitmore swung the door open suddenly, but no one stood outside. Only darkness and the quiet fields beyond. He stepped out onto the porch and raised the lantern. The wind moved through the cotton fields. Then he noticed something on the wooden floor of the porch, a small object. Whitmore bent down and picked it up. It was a child's ribbon, old, worn. His face slowly changed. He recognized it. It belonged to Liza. Before he could react, the lantern behind him went out. Darkness swallowed the porch. Whitmore turned quickly, and a figure stepped out of the shadows. Minerva. Her face was calm, but her eyes held years of pain. Whitmore lifted the rifle instantly. "You should have stayed quiet," he said coldly. "You people forget your place." Minerva didn't move. "You took everything from me," she said quietly. Whitmore laughed. She was nothing, just another. The shot never finished, because Whitmore never pulled the trigger. The rifle slipped from his hands. He looked down in shock. A knife had already buried itself deep into his side. Minerva moved faster than he expected. Whitmore staggered backward against the porch railing. Blood slowly spread across his shirt. His eyes filled with disbelief. "You—" Minerva stepped closer. "You said she was property," she whispered. Whitmore tried to speak again, but no words came out. The powerful owner of Red Hollow Plantation collapsed onto the wooden floor.
For the first time in his life, he was powerless. Minerva stood over him silently. The wind moved across the empty fields. Inside the cabins, the workers slept. They would wake the next morning to find their master dead, and the plantation changed forever. But Minerva did not stay to watch. Before sunrise, she walked away from Red Hollow, into the woods, into the darkness. No one ever saw her again. Some believed she escaped north. Others believed she disappeared into the wilderness. But one thing became legend among the workers who remained. They said the plantation was never the same after that night. Because sometimes history remembers the powerful, but sometimes it remembers the quiet revenge of those who were never meant to survive.
The morning after Edward Whitmore was found dead, Red Hollow Plantation woke to chaos. Servants were the first to discover the body. He was lying on the wooden porch, blood dried across the floor. His rifle was still beside him, but the killer was gone. Within hours, word spread across the plantation. The master was dead, the overseer was missing, and Daniel Croft had already vanished weeks earlier. To the outside world, it looked like a series of strange accidents. But inside the cabins, the workers knew something different. They whispered a single name, Minerva. No one said it loudly. Even in freedom, fear remained. But deep down, many believed the truth. Justice had finally come to Red Hollow. Local authorities arrived days later. They questioned everyone. They searched the barns. They searched the woods. They searched the cotton fields. Eventually, they discovered something disturbing, a patch of disturbed earth in the far field. When they dug there, they found the body of Thomas Hale, buried beneath the soil. The pit trap had collapsed during the storm, revealing what had happened. The discovery shocked the investigators, but it also created more questions. Who had built the trap? Who had killed the plantation owner? And why had Daniel Croft vanished without a trace? The workers said nothing. They kept their heads down and answered every question carefully. No one mentioned Minerva. No one mentioned Liza, because on plantations like Red Hollow, truth was dangerous. Weeks later, the case quietly faded. The authorities blamed Croft's disappearance on gambling deaths. They called Hale's death a tragic accident, and Whitmore's murder remained unsolved. But the story did not disappear. Over the years, travelers passing through the region heard strange rumors. Some said a woman had been seen walking through the forests at night, always alone, always silent. Others claimed former workers sometimes left small ribbons near the old plantation ruins, a sign of respect, a symbol of remembrance. Because long after the cotton fields were abandoned, and long after the plantation collapsed, the story of Red Hollow remained, not as a tale of cruelty, but as a reminder that sometimes history forgets the powerless, but sometimes someone survives long enough to change it. And when that happens, even the darkest places can produce legends. Legends born from grief, from silence, and from a mother who refused to forget. Years passed after the fall of Red Hollow Plantation. The cotton fields that once stretched across the land slowly turned wild. Nature began reclaiming everything. The big house where Edward Whitmore once ruled with fear slowly rotted away. Windows shattered, wooden walls collapsed, and vines crawled across the empty porch where he had taken his final breath. Most people avoided the place completely. Travelers passing through the area preferred to take longer roads just to stay away from the abandoned plantation. But sometimes, curiosity is stronger than fear. In 1872, a group of hunters entered the forest near the old plantation while tracking deer. As the sun began to set, they accidentally found the ruins of Red Hollow. The hunters walked through the broken gates and into the overgrown fields. Everything was silent, too silent. One of the hunters noticed something strange near the center of the field. Small pieces of cloth, tied carefully to wooden sticks. Dozens of them, old ribbons moving slowly in the wind. The hunters moved closer, and that was when the oldest man among them recognized what they were. Children's ribbons, just like the one Liza used to wear. But something even stranger happened that night. As darkness spread across the field, the hunters began hearing something carried by the wind. At first, it sounded like the rustling of the cotton plants, but then it became clearer. A soft humming, a quiet melody, almost like someone singing far away in the dark. The hunters froze. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the field, slowly moving through the plants. One of the men lifted his lantern higher. For a moment, just for a second, he thought he saw a figure standing between the rows of cotton. A woman, still, watching. Then the wind blew stronger, the lantern flickered, and the figure was gone. The hunters left the plantation immediately and never returned. But over the years, the same story appeared again and again. Travelers claimed to hear singing in the empty fields. Others said they saw ribbons tied to the broken fence every spring, as if someone still visited the place, quietly, silently. Some believed it was just superstition, a ghost story created by locals. But the former workers who had once lived on Red Hollow knew something different. They believed Minerva had never truly disappeared. They believed she stayed near the land where her daughter had died, not as a ghost, not as a monster, but as a memory, a reminder that even in the darkest parts of history, there were people who refused to stay silent. And sometimes, the wind carries their stories long after they are gone.
History books rarely mention places like Red Hollow. They talk about wars, presidents, and empires, but the quiet suffering that happened in places like plantations was often ignored or deliberately forgotten. Red Hollow was eventually erased from official records. The land was sold, the buildings collapsed, and the plantation name slowly disappeared from maps. But history has a strange way of surviving, not in books, not in government records, but in stories. Old descendants of the workers who once lived there continued passing down the same story, generation after generation. They spoke about a woman who refused to stay silent, a mother who watched her daughter taken from her, and a mother who decided that silence was no longer an option. Her name was Minerva. Some historians claim the story is exaggerated. Others believe parts of it may be true. But one fact remains undeniable. In the records of the region, 3 powerful men connected to Red Hollow Plantation all disappeared within a single month. Daniel Croft, Thomas Hale, Edward Whitmore. None of their cases were ever solved. No official killer was ever found, and no court ever delivered justice. But sometimes justice does not arrive in courtrooms. Sometimes it walks quietly through the night, patient, watching, waiting. And when the time finally comes, history changes in ways no one expected. The ruins of Red Hollow Plantation still exist somewhere deep in the countryside, hidden beneath forests and forgotten roads. Most people will never find it, but if you ever pass through the old cotton fields at night, some locals say the wind still carries a quiet sound, a soft humming, a mother's voice singing the same lullaby she once sang to her daughter, a reminder
that even when history tries to bury the truth, some stories refuse to stay silent, and some legends never truly die.
Today, almost nothing remains of Red Hollow Plantation. The fields that once forced hundreds of people into endless labor are now covered with tall grass and wild trees. The big house where Edward Whitmore ruled with fear collapsed many years ago. Only broken wood and rusted iron remain. Time erased the buildings, but it never erased the story. Historians still debate what really happened there. Some believe the deaths and disappearances were just coincidences. Others think the truth was simply hidden to protect powerful people. But the descendants of the workers who once lived there tell a different story. A story of pain, a story of loss, and a story of a mother who refused to let her daughter's death be forgotten. Her name was Minerva, a woman history never officially recorded, yet the legend of her courage survived longer than the men who once controlled that land. Because power fades, empires fall, and names written in books are eventually forgotten. But the stories carried by people, those survive forever. Maybe the real truth of Red Hollow will never be fully known. Maybe the wind that moves across those empty fields is just wind. Or maybe it carries the memory of a woman who turned grief into justice. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, someone is always watching, waiting, and refusing to forget. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not about kings or empires. They are about ordinary people who decided that enough was enough. And that is the story of Red Hollow, a place history tried to bury, but a story the world will never completely erase. History has a strange habit of burying the most dangerous truths beneath silence. Not because the events did not happen, but because the people in power understood that some stories are more threatening than weapons. The night at Red Hollow Plantation was one of those stories. Official records claimed it was a wild animal attack. Newspapers described it as an unfortunate accident caused by predators wandering too close to human settlement. The men who died were called victims of nature. The enslaved people who lived there were questioned, watched, and threatened. But the deeper truth was never written in ink, because the truth was terrifying to those who depended on control. If a woman with no money, no weapon, and no official power could destroy 6 powerful men with nothing but patience and intelligence, then the entire system built on fear was weaker than anyone wanted to admit. And systems built on fear cannot survive if people realize the fear is an illusion. That is why Minerva's name disappeared from the official record. Her escape was labeled as a simple runaway. Her actions were never investigated too closely. Plantation owners in the region preferred the story of wild animals because animals cannot inspire rebellion. Animals cannot teach strategy. Animals cannot awaken courage. But a woman like Minerva could, and that was far more dangerous. For months after the Red Hollow incident, plantation houses across Georgia changed their habits. Large nighttime gatherings became rare. Verandas that once remained open were shut tightly after sunset. Guards were placed near the tree lines. Hunting dogs were kept closer to the main house instead of the barns. The forest that once looked peaceful suddenly felt like an enemy. Men who believed themselves untouchable began to feel something unfamiliar: vulnerability. Because the truth they feared most was simple. Minerva had not used guns. She had not gathered an army. She had not shouted rebellion in the streets. She had simply watched, studied, waited. And when the moment came, she used the one thing no system can fully control: nature itself. The forest had always been there.
The panthers had always been there. The cougars had always been there. The only difference was that one woman understood how to turn patience into power. And once a man learns that power does not always belong to those with titles and money, the entire structure of control begins to crack. But the story does not end with the deaths inside Red Hollow, because revenge may close one chapter, but it rarely ends the war. Far beyond the plantation fields, whispers about a mysterious woman began spreading quietly through communities that had long lived under the shadow of chains. Some called her a ghost. Some called her a spirit sent by God. But a few understood something deeper. She was proof that even the most powerful men could fall. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the world is the one everyone believes is powerless. And somewhere in the deep forests of Georgia, Minerva was still walking, not hiding, not running, but moving toward something much bigger than revenge. Because once a person crosses the line between fear and freedom, they never truly go back. And the world they leave behind can never feel safe again.
The forest does something strange to a man who spends enough time inside it. It strips away illusions. Inside the walls of plantations, power looked permanent. Men sat behind polished tables and believed the world would always obey them. Money reinforced their confidence. Weapons reinforced their authority. Laws reinforced their control. But the forest obeyed none of those things. Out there, titles meant nothing. Money meant nothing. Reputation meant nothing. Only awareness mattered. Only patience. Only survival. And that was the world Minerva now understood better than any man who hunted her. Days passed as she and her daughter moved deeper into the wilderness north of Savannah. They traveled slowly, avoiding roads and settlements. Not because Minerva feared people, but because people talked, and talk could travel faster than footsteps. The girl was still weak from months inside the brothel. Her body had endured things no child should ever experience, but her spirit had not broken. Every morning she walked a little stronger. Every evening her eyes held more life. Minerva noticed it in the way her daughter watched the trees, in the way she listened to birds, in the way she asked quiet questions about the forest, questions about how animals move, how hunters track, how predators wait. Minerva answered each one carefully, because knowledge was no longer just survival, it was inheritance. But far behind them, something else was growing. Fear. The death of 6 wealthy men had shaken the plantation world more than anyone admitted publicly. Owners began meeting privately. Discussions were held in quiet rooms behind closed doors. They spoke about security, about patrols, about runaway slaves. But beneath those discussions lived a deeper concern. What if Red Hollow was not an accident? What if it was a message? Because systems built on domination rely on a very fragile belief that those beneath them are incapable of planning, incapable of intelligence, incapable of rebellion. But Minerva had shattered that belief. And belief, once cracked, never returns to its original strength. Meanwhile, hunters continued searching the forests around Red Hollow. They followed animal tracks, set traps, released bloodhounds. But they were chasing ghosts. The panthers and cougars had already returned to their natural territory, far beyond the plantation borders. Animals do not remain where chaos has happened. They move, disappear, adapt, just like the woman who had guided them. And somewhere along a quiet ridge overlooking a winding river, Minerva paused beside her daughter as the sun began to fall. The sky burned orange through tall pine branches. The air carried the sound of distant water. For the first time since leaving Savannah, they rested without urgency. Her daughter sat beside her on a fallen log and spoke softly. "Will they ever stop hunting us?" Minerva looked out across the endless forest. For a long moment she said nothing, because the honest answer was complicated. Men who lose power rarely forget. They chase revenge. They chase control. They chase the illusion that fear can be restored. Finally, she turned to her daughter and spoke quietly. "Some will." She pointed toward the horizon where the forest stretched farther than the eye could see. "But the world is bigger than the men who hurt us." The girl followed her gaze. For the first time in months, she smiled. Not a wide smile, just a small one. But it was enough, because something powerful had shifted. For years, the world had been a cage around them. Now the cage had cracks. And once a person learns that cages can break, they begin to see the world differently. But what Minerva did not yet know was this. Her story was already spreading far beyond Georgia. Whispers had begun moving along hidden paths, through dock workers, through traveling preachers, through escaped slaves heading north. Stories about a woman who commanded the forest, a woman who waited 8 months for revenge, a woman who proved that patience could destroy power. And stories have a strange kind of power. They travel farther than horses, faster than newspapers, and sometimes they ignite fires in places no one expects. Because somewhere, someone was hearing the story of Red Hollow for the first time and realizing something dangerous. If one woman could do this.
The water was cold enough to numb the skin within seconds. Minerva stepped deeper into the narrow stream, guiding her daughter carefully behind her. The current was not strong, but it was steady, sliding over smooth stones and carrying away scent with every passing second. This was not an accident. She had learned long ago that dogs followed smell, not sight. Water confused them. They moved slowly through the stream for several minutes, stepping only on submerged rock where possible. Each step was chosen with patience. Panic would leave signs. Patience erased them. Behind them, somewhere beyond the trees, the distant barking grew louder. Riders had begun to close the distance. Minerva lifted her daughter onto a large stone near the opposite bank and helped her climb onto dry ground. Then she remained in the stream alone for a moment longer, walking several yards upstream before finally stepping out beneath a thick cluster of hanging branches. To anyone tracking them, the trail would now appear broken. Dogs would circle the bank, confused. Riders would shout orders. Time would be lost, and time was the only weapon she needed now. Her daughter leaned against a tree, breathing hard but determined not to complain. The girl's strength surprised Minerva. Pain had carved something deeper into her spirit during those months in Savannah. She was no longer the humming child who once stitched cloth in the plantation yard. She had changed. But the quiet strength in her eyes told Minerva something important. She had not been broken. Minerva knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We keep moving," she whispered softly. Her daughter nodded. They continued north, deeper into woodland where fewer roads crossed and fewer riders traveled. The forest thickened with towering pines and tangled undergrowth that swallowed sound. Birds called occasionally, but even they seemed cautious. The world here felt older, wilder, less controlled by the rules of men. For hours they walked in silence. Minerva remained alert to every detail: a snapped twig, a sudden silence in the trees, the distant clink of metal that might signal riders passing somewhere unseen.
But as the afternoon stretched into evening, something unexpected happened. The barking faded, not slowly, abruptly, as if the dogs had lost the trail entirely. Minerva allowed herself a small breath of relief, but did not slow their pace. Hunters rarely gave up after one failure. They would regroup, they would search new paths. Men like those who owned plantations did not easily accept humiliation, and what happened at Red Hollow was more than humiliation. It was a warning, a reminder that the people they believed powerless were capable of patience far greater than their own. As twilight settled over the forest, Minerva found a small clearing hidden between thick pines. Fallen branches formed a natural barrier that shielded them from view on three sides. It was a good place to rest. For the first time since leaving Savannah, they sat together without moving. The forest grew quiet around them. A gentle wind moved through the treetops. Her daughter stared into the darkening woods for a long time before finally speaking. "Did the animals suffer?" she asked quietly. Minerva understood the question immediately. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "They returned to the forest." Her daughter nodded, absorbing the answer. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the girl whispered something that made Minerva's chest tighten. "You waited 8 months." It was not a question, it was recognition. Minerva looked toward the fading sky through the pine branches. "Yes," she said softly, "because some storms must be built slowly." The fireflies began appearing between the trees, small lights drifting through darkness like quiet spirits. Somewhere far away, an owl called into the night. The forest had accepted them. But beyond those trees, beyond the miles of wilderness stretching northward, a different storm was beginning to form. Plantation owners were angry, lawmen were gathering, and a story was spreading through Georgia that frightened powerful men more than any animal attack. A story about a woman who had turned patience into a weapon and escaped. But the truth was something even those rumors had not yet discovered. Minerva had not simply escaped. She had changed the rules. And when rules change, the people who once held power often become the most dangerous hunters of all. Minerva stepped directly into the water and did not hesitate. Cold current wrapped around her ankles, then her calves, carrying away the scent the dogs would follow. She motioned for her daughter to do the same. The girl entered slowly, biting her lip as the chill climbed up her legs. Neither complained. They walked against the current, not fast, not careless, each step deliberate, the way hunters moved when they knew the forest was watching. Behind them, somewhere far beyond the trees, the men with dogs believed they were closing the distance. They believed horses and rifles gave them power. They believed rage made them unstoppable. But rage blinds. Minerva had learned that months ago. She guided her daughter along the stream for nearly half a mile before climbing out onto a patch of flat stone where no mud held footprints. The girl looked back once, instinctively searching the path they had taken. Minerva gently turned her head forward again. "Never look back," she whispered. The words were not harsh, they were instruction. Looking back meant fear. Fear meant hesitation, and hesitation in a hunted world could be the difference between breathing and disappearing. They moved deeper into the forest, where the pine trees thickened and sunlight struggled to reach the ground. The air grew cooler there, heavy with moss and silence. Minerva knew this kind of land. The forest did not belong to plantation masters. It did not belong to sheriffs or judges or traders who counted human lives like cattle. The forest belonged to patience, and patience was something Minerva possessed in terrifying amounts. Hours passed. The barking of dogs faded until it became nothing more than memory carried by the wind. Finally, they reached a ridge overlooking miles of untouched woodland. From that height, the world looked different. No fences, no cotton rows, no overseers shouting orders across fields. Just trees, endless trees. Her daughter stood beside her, breathing slowly, the exhaustion of weeks still lingering in her bones. "Where are we going?" the girl asked quietly. Minerva looked toward the northern horizon. For a long moment she did not answer. Then she spoke in a tone steady as stone. "Somewhere men like them cannot reach." But deep inside, she knew something more complicated than that. The men from Red Hollow were dead. The brothel had been left behind, yet the system that created those places was still breathing, still powerful, still hunting. And as the wind moved through the trees, Minerva realized something that very few people in that century would ever understand. She had not just taken revenge. She had proven something far more dangerous, that patience, intelligence, and silence could dismantle power from the shadows. And once the powerful learned that truth, they begin to fear the quiet ones. The forest changed the further north they walked. At first it felt like freedom, the absence of shouting, the absence of chains. No bells calling workers to fields before sunrise, no boots pacing wooden porches while men measured obedience like it was currency. But freedom in the wilderness was not soft. It demanded awareness. Minerva understood this better than most people alive in that time. Freedom was not simply the removal of chains. Freedom was the constant responsibility of staying alive. Every sound mattered. Every broken branch carried meaning. She moved through the forest like someone who belonged to it, not rushing, not hiding in panic, but adjusting to the rhythm of the land. Her daughter followed closely behind, learning with every mile. The girl was quiet now, quieter than before the brothel, quieter even than she had been inside Red Hollow. Trauma had hollowed something inside her. But Minerva noticed something else growing in its place. Attention. The girl watched the ground the way hunters did. She noticed bird calls changing. She noticed the sudden silence that sometimes fell across the trees when something larger moved nearby. Pain had sharpened her senses. Sometimes the world breaks a person. Sometimes it forges them. By midday, they reached an abandoned logging trail that had long since been reclaimed by grass and moss. The path curved north toward hill country, where fewer plantations existed, and patrol riders grew thin. Minerva paused there. She knelt and placed her palm against the dirt. Still warm, but untouched. No horses had passed recently. Good. They continued along the trail, but Minerva did not relax. She never allowed comfort to dull her instincts. The men hunting them were not simply angry plantation owners. They were protectors of a system, and systems do not forgive threats. By evening, clouds rolled across the sky, turning the forest dim long before sunset. Thunder murmured somewhere far away. Rain was coming. Minerva welcomed it. Rain erased trails. Rain silenced footsteps. Rain confused dogs. When the storm finally arrived, it came hard and sudden. Heavy drops crashed through leaves and soaked the earth within minutes. The forest floor turned dark and slick. Minerva dived her daughter beneath a rock overhang where they could rest without being exposed. For a while, neither spoke. They simply listened to the storm. Then the girl asked something quietly. "Did you always know what to do?" Minerva watched the rain falling beyond the stone shelter. "No," she answered. Her voice carried no pride. Knowing came slowly. She paused before continuing. "When they took you, something inside me stopped being afraid.
The girl lowered her head. The rain grew heavier. Minerva looked out into the darkening woods again and added something that sounded less like comfort and more like truth. Fear keeps people obedient. Another flash of lightning illuminated the forest. For the first time, she said, I had nothing left they could take. The girl thought about those words carefully. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills like a warning moving through the sky. But the storm outside was not the most dangerous thing moving across the land that night, because while Minerva and her daughter rested beneath stone and rain erased their tracks, men with authority were beginning to realize something far more unsettling than an escaped slave. They were beginning to realize a legend was forming. A woman who could command the forest, a mother who had turned predators into weapons, a survivor who had slipped through plantation walls, city streets, and now vanished into wilderness. Stories like that do something dangerous. They spread. And once a story spreads, it becomes something stronger than fear. It becomes an idea. And ideas, once planted in the minds of the oppressed, are far harder to hunt down than any person alive.